Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you guys are ready for Chapter 2 of the Queen's Games. If you have not listened to Chapter 1, go to the previous video, listen to that one first, otherwise you might be completely at a loss. Hope you guys enjoy it. Chapter 2, Bracket Wars. A battle was easy. It was the war that would be hard on each of them. Each of the brackets would be a fairly simple fight, but fighting back-to-back all evening could be what would wear Ember's strength and patience thin. The sword hilt hung heavy against her hip as a reminder of her abilities. She was thankful that she had placed it inside the watch at the end of her session the previous morning, otherwise she would be forced to depend on her powers, which would wear her out sooner. Her powers were strong and made her a formidable opponent, but she needed to refuel, otherwise she would wear out. The setup was an easy-to-follow system. Each of the men would enter the arena, fight all of their opponents, and then retire for the evening. The women would be forced to fight each of them unless they did not survive a matchup. It would allow them a break between the fights, but who knew how long these would last? In the first round, Ember was betted to go against Maverick from the House of Charms. She would be the first to fight in the games. She had a feeling it was planned that way, so that they could watch her and see just how powerful she was. However, she planned to contain herself. She had not had proper rest and did not want to overexert herself too early. "This is almost unfair," Ember whispered to herself as she was called to the arena's floor from the woman's waiting box. Sure, the man was gorgeous, but that was where his advantage ended. She stood in waiting, watching to see what his first move would be, bracing as he opened his mouth and began to voice how she should surrender herself unto him, and they should return to his chambers for the evening. The barrage of calmness and ease filled her body, coaxing her to follow the man with silver eyes and honey-colored hair, but she was focused on her values, which washed away the feeling. Specifically, she was focused on her pride. There was no universe in which she would let a man charm her into his chambers for any reason, let alone in order to win a battle. She smiled, stepped closer, and held out her hand. His excitement flickered to life and extinguished as her palm ignited. Flame in hand, she backed him into a wall and burnt the collar of his suit before he surrendered, annoyance at the rejection clear as glass in his eyes. "Strong will. I like that in a woman," he whispered as she turned on her heel, allowing her hair to slap him across the face as she returned to the box. At home, she had supporters who had watched her lessons and would give her a round of high-fives and praises when she had done well. But her return was not noticed by a single one of the women. She took her spot in the corner and watched as the rest of the women battled against the man from the House of Charms. What she had put him through was nothing in comparison to what some of the women decided to do to him. She watched Kylie plow him over with a fountain of water before he could even fully open his mouth. He yielded and shouted to Ember that she should come and dry his clothes. He pouted when she refused to do so, her thoughts still on his strong will comment. Maria was smart and quick. She decided to play to his weakness of thinking his words were all so powerful. He sang his song and she acted enamored before closing in and blinding him. He blinked until he realized the real reason the world had gone dark was because he was face down in the dirt. The Lucent girl smirked as she rushed back to the others, all smiles at her own accomplishment. Ember could not help but smile and nod at her when Maria sat beside her. Claudia, though, she struggled in her battle against Maverick. Ember watched from the edge of her seat, trying to locate the woman as she moved across the arena. Claudia was forced from her hiding place as his words made her blush and lose her concentration. Once Maverick spotted her over his shoulder, he had turned up the charm and made her stutter out her refusal to battle him further. The first loss for the women was recorded. Ember watched as the tick was placed on the board, marking the loss. It stung in her heart, but she could not quite understand why it did. It was not her loss. She should feel indifferent. The next battle was to be hosted by Austin from the House of Lucent. His white locks were long and tied back with a gold ribbon. His blue eyes were a mirror image of calm waters on a sunny day. He walked with light feet, barely even disturbing the dirt on the ground and keeping his white armor unstained. The first one to battle him would be of his own house. Maria grinned as she took to the ground and shouted, "Ready for the rematch, Austin?" The crowd began to shout, excitement thrilling through them as they realized this could be a good match. The crowd was sorely disappointed. Maria beat Austin in a flash, quite literally. He had tried to outshine her, and everyone had to look away as the light became blinding, and ended with Austin laying flat on the ground with Maria on top of him. With no further explanation needed, the victory was recorded for Maria, and she skipped away from the man who was busy trying to clean his robes. His curses were enough to make Addison fan her cheeks and look away. All of his attempts at cleaning would prove unnecessary, since Claudia had suffocated his light, and while he was stumbling through a thick cloud of shadows, she decked him and floored him instantly. "Idiot," she had scoffed before disappearing into the air. The crowd waited, watching to see if she had left the arena before Ember was called forward. As she made her way to the floor, Austin looked cocky. "Think you can outshine me, Fire Girl?" A roll of her eyes, and Ember decided it was time to use her weapon, seeing as this boy had no clue who he was dealing with if he had resorted to name-calling. He decided to insult her house powers, and she was determined to make him regret that, and never forget why the House of Inferno was powerful. She pulled the hilt away from her suit and called the flames to form a blade. It was beautiful, the blade curving just the right way to be deadly without singeing her clothes if she was not in her armor. She made no more movements so that she could keep him from taking in her fighting style. Instead, she held still and set her sights on him. Austin pulled out what looked like a giant glow stick, and she had to stop herself from laughing at it. More specifically, how proud he looked to be holding a glowing tube that was inelegant and looked ready to slip out of his hand if she hit it too hard. Suddenly, it dawned on her that this was the tube he had held on his back, and while she was busy taking in his ridiculous weapon, he charged her. Austin rushing her was his first mistake, and the most deadly if she had been in a real battle where they would be fighting to the death. It allowed her time to calculate his attack and see how he fought. He swung wildly, with no obvious training. Did he really only rely on his powers to sway the winnings in his favor? She parried and blocked and measured his strikes' timing, almost guilty of how easy this battle was going to resolve itself. Should this even be a battle in the games if half of the men were useless against her? A step back on her behalf was his undoing. He followed her stride, allowing her to maneuver his glow stick from his grasp, knocking it aside and taking him to the floor in one fluid motion. His back hit the ground with a thud that echoed through the arena, causing him to hiss out in pain. "I do not think that outshining you is necessary, Austin." Her blade was at his throat, and the end of his beard was curling, burning at the heat. He smacked the floor in surrender, envy throwing off of him in waves. She reached out and helped him back to his feet, willing to show kindness to the man who was never properly taught how to battle with a weapon. "I suggest you working on your swordsmanship. It is a bit erratic." "Erratic as is how my heart beats for you," Austin said, gripping his chest and reaching to take her hand back, but she was quick on her feet and outmaneuvered him once more. She felt her skin crawl and turned to rush back to the waiting box. "How cute," she said without sparing a glance back. She quickly walked back to the line of women, ignoring the man who was on his knees for her. She was surprised at first when Kylie fell victim to him, unable to figure out where he was once he had blinded her. She was used to the dark while the rest of them were used to having blinding lights in their eyes from their own powers. The mark next to her name at the loss made Kylie flinch before raising her hand in a crude gesture at Austin, causing the gathered people to shout with laughter at her antics. The longer they were here, the more Ember realized that these were named games for a reason. Their suffering and pain was for the entertainment and enjoyment of the crowd around them. The nobles were sitting there and watching their every move, laughing at their wounds and relishing in the joy it caused them. They drank gallons of mead and contributed currency chips to betting pools on who would marry who. This was another reason Ember wanted these games to burn to the ground. No one should ever have to suffer through this again. When it came his turn, Vlad of the House of Titles turned out to be a literal loose cannon. His technique was well thought out, but basic, throwing water bombs at them, causing each girl to become soaked, but the only one who fell victim to him was Maria, who became too frustrated and became trapped face first on the ground with a wave of water. Ember beat him with ease, just ducking beneath the ball he was creating and letting her blade settle just far enough from his face to make him sweat without damaging him. "Some agility you got there, Inferno. We should train together sometime," he said before yelping as her sword came closer before the flames fell away. "In your dreams, Vlad," she said with a grimace. She had an astute idea that his form of training was not the same as hers, and did not care for it in the slightest. And then it came time for the Crown Prince, Cain. the son of the king and queen, to battle the women from whom he would choose to wed. Dawn was on the horizon, and his red hair shone in the early morning sun, reflecting the rays of morning light like a flickering flame. These fights should have been a fast defeat for all of them if he had been trained as properly as a man of a royal family. Ember's thought showed true as Maria was sucked into a puddle after 30 seconds, and the queen revealed she had been sucked into the lower levels and had retired to her room after the defeat. The astonishment at his powers erupted in her, but she forced it back down. This was the power of any properly trained title. Vlad should have been able to do the same if he focused hard enough, but he was too distracted with showing off. This would be a true opponent for her to fight. The most challenging fighter was left for last, after the women were up all evening and most likely exhausted. The next fight was equally matched. Ember watched the way Kylie spun with water collecting around her in a swirl, like a ballerina controlling the reins. Kane, however, dodged every attack with grace and fluidity before returning with his own attack. Once they grew tired of the dancing, they had opted for their swords, and the real portion of the battle had begun, drawing cheers and boos as strikes almost landed home before someone danced their way out of the range of the attack. Kylie and Kane had been locked in battle for closer to an hour before she had grasped her own throat, collapsing and smacking the ground in a yield. Kane's extended hand dropped, and Kylie coughed up blood. Horror-stricken, Ember realized Kane had caused Kylie to suffocate on her own blood, having grown tired of the cat-and-mouse games they played, neither able to outplay the other even when they had reduced their actions to swordplay. Ember swallowed back her fear as she watched the crimson droplets pelt the dirt, and she reminded herself to keep a level head in these types of situations. She would not let him go aboard as Kylie had, which meant he would not make her suffocate. Claudia had done well, landing hits from the shadows. Kane had been knocked around, respect radiating off of him as the hits continued to land. He never saw it coming, and he began to laugh as each came faster than the last, kicking up more dirt than any of the other times Claudia had battled. It looked like she would win, until he caught her by the wrist and blasted her with water against the wall until she yielded. The final tick mark against her name making her the one tied with Maria for last place. Ember, House of Inferno. Prince Kane, her future king, greeted her as she met him on the arena's battlegrounds. No longer was the dirt dry, now it was thick mud that would slow her movements and cause her to stick if she fell. His green eyes sparkled like a sea while his hair looked like a mop of flames flickering. Dawn was well into the morning, and there were many more faces appearing in the crowd, curious to watch the future king battle the woman of the forsaken noble house. She was willing to give them a show that they would never forget now that she had a worthy opponent. She just hoped he was not too exhausted from everything he had already endured. Prince Kane, House of Titles, she nodded back, her fingers tightening around her hilt, wondering what trick would he use on her. Would he attempt to charm her? No, that was more his mother's type than his own. Cloak and dagger seemed too dramatic for his tactics. She watched him with renewed curiosity. She had no clue what trick he had left up his sleeve to try and win. She had already seen his swordsmanship, the vast ways he could use his powers and his wit. How was he going to try to defeat her? The answer to her question was nowhere to be found, even as he lifted his hand palm up and created a globe of water no bigger than an apple. He gave no indication of how he planned to fight her. He watched it with eager eyes as it continued to swirl but not grow. Water tends to put fire out. That was his comment before he turned his face away from his swirling water and towards Ember. He was waiting for a reaction, trying to throw her off her game and get her to make the first move. They were playing the waiting game, neither quite willing to throw the first strike. It can, but not if it gets evaporated first. An idea struck Ember with her words. She had been partial to using her powers too much, wanting to conserve her energy. But what if the key to winning against the prince was using them to their fullest extent? The way he watched her gave no indication of knowing what her plan was. He held himself high, not appearing weary from the fights he had before her. She would have been impressed, but she saw the way he was leaning heavily on his right leg, supporting himself in the way that he was shown just how exhausted he had to be from their overnight activities. His hand pulled in without any warning, ready to throw his power at her in a strike that would make it hard to activate her powers. And Ember made her split-second decision. A flame licked up her fingers, and she willed it to spread across her skin, igniting the air around her into a burning hot inferno. Kane's water attack came only within 10 feet of her before it evaporated, steaming into the air. "Is that the best you have, Prince Kane?" she goaded, wanting him to react. React he did. His title made his cheeks turn violet red against his pale skin, and he created another globe of swirling waves between his fingers before throwing it with enough force that would have knocked her off her feet. But it too followed the same fate as the first. The wisps of steam curled around her shield, and she would have smiled if it were not so concentrated on maintaining the power. Sorry guys, my watch was buzzing. Ember advanced on the prince, and he backed himself into the arena wall behind him, shocked on his face as she continued to make each of the attacks not affect her. The shield of flames in front of her grew erratic the longer she held it, exhaustion painting each of her steps. Sweat began to bead on her forehead, but she pushed on. Fatigue ached in her bones, and her sword felt heavy in her palm, but she did not dare let its point drop. Kane had a constant water flow on her, and it had become harder to breathe, but still, it did not penetrate the shield she had burning around her. The heat began to fade from within as the tongues of the fire became less pulled together and holes began to appear. She took a final step forward and used the rest of her energy to cover the holes and push the heat onto a constant pressure. The flow died off and her flames flickered out as the prince hissed, "I yield." His back was against the wall and relief flooded through her. Ember was thankful, her knees wavering as they tried to hold her upright. She lost her concentration, swayed in the air, and fell to the side as she collapsed on herself with fatigue. She was surprised to find the prince catching her, and both of them landing against the ground with a thunk. "That was wonderful," he said, but she was not sure that she had heard him correctly. Nonetheless, she felt flattered at the compliment he had potentially paid her. The battle indeed had been one of the most trying, but it left her with more satisfaction than any of the other wins. This win meant something to her, and to the entire audience who was roaring in the stands at the outrage. Their prince had been bested, and none were pleased. Ember, House of Inferno, is the winner of the first round of the games, the queen announced, glaring down at the woman who was leaning heavily against her son. Soldiers approached the two and lifted them to their feet, separating them from each other. There was no cheering from the crowd, most too shocked by the scene they had witnessed. The ones who were screaming, their words were unkind. None of that mattered to Ember, though. She came, conquered, and proven her worth. What Ember did not know was that the prince had gone undefeated for years. She was the first to make him yield since his teen years. The man was skilled with a sword, but knew how to work his way through a battlefield like none other. Prince Kane knew how to fight when exhausted and defeated, but she had been the first to force him to yield. That's the end of chapter 2. I hope you guys enjoy it. Chapter 3 is coming up soon.